Hi, Brian.
Good morning, Anne.
Well, let me introduce you to the Blogging Heads audience. I'm really glad to have you on the show. You're Brian
Thank you.
Dunning of the Skeptoid Show, and people know me, maybe remember me. I'm Anne Althouse. Tell us a little. Welcome to the show.
Well, the podcast, Skeptoid, Critical Analysis of Pop Phenomena. It's a weekly podcast. You can get it on iTunes or at skeptoid.com. And it's a short format, 10 minutes long. And each week I pick some pop culture phenomenon that people generally believe in. And that can be anything that's pseudoscientific or that's paranormal or that's consumer fraud. And I just give the scientific perspective. I hesitate to use the word debunking, but that's kind of what people commonly call it. It has an audience of about 60,000 per week.
Oh, you have 60,000. That's great. Well, let's try to get more people to go over there because it really is a great podcast. I discovered it on the iTunes store just looking at what the most popular podcasts are. Probably really boosted your listenership once that happened, didn't it? Did it really help?
It sure did, iTunes? Yeah. It took about a year to finally get up onto page 1 of iTunes, and once it did... it went from 13,000 to 40,000 in just a couple of days when it got onto page 1.
Great. Well, wait till you see what happens with the Blogging Heads boost.
I'm excited.
So I started listening to it at that point, and I downloaded all the podcasts, and I've listened to them all. I find it very entertaining, and one thing about it that's so good is that it's so compressed. In 10 minutes, you do a lot, and you have this very charming, I think, humorous voice that makes good listening. But you always tell a little story of some mysterious thing, which is often like a little ghost story or something like that, or some scientific belief that some people may actually already believe, like that it's good to take vitamins and eat organic food and so forth, and terrible to have genetically modified food. But then you go forward to I think debunk it or explain it, but also kind of teach people critical thinking and unravel the story in a way that sounds casual. It makes a good podcast, but is also really short and crisp. So I think it's a great example just generally for doing a good podcast, as opposed to all the rambling podcasts people think are
that's actually
charming.
A lot of the feedback that I get is people appreciate how it's, I don't have any intro, there's no music, there's no, advertisements or talking about it starts, it's into content, and it's over. And I get feedback a lot that people appreciate that because it's hard to fast forward in an iPod, quite frankly. So a lot of people.
So many people start their podcasts with some music that you really just don't want to hear, like some rock music, some band they know or whatever. I mean, I'm guilty of that myself. But
oh, I'm sorry.
No, I don't really think it's good. I mean, it's a good model for podcasts generally, and I hope everybody goes and listens to it. But and you also have a book, right?
Yeah, there's a book called Skeptoid, same title as the podcast. It's based on the first 50 episodes, and right here I'm showing you the second volume, which is this is an advanced proof copy. It should come out in a couple of weeks, so maybe by the time that this goes live. But that's based on the second 50 episodes of the podcast, adapted for print, obviously, and reworked a little bit to fit into book form. And it's, most people don't listen to podcasts, quite frankly, so getting the book is a great way to share the critical thinking message with people who don't listen to podcasts. Yeah,
and you also put the text of the podcast online, which I really appreciate as a blogger. It really helps bloggers if you listen to the podcast and then you want to discuss it in a blog post. The fact that you don't have to transcribe anything and that you can search for the text and get the quotes that you want really helps people link to you. So I think that, too, is a good model for
the website is basically a blog version of the same content in the podcast. So, yeah.
Now, to help people understand the kinds of things that you do, tell us about some of the particular stories that you've done. Like, for example, which do you think are your very best, or which are your favorites, or a good place to start for people? Just highlight a couple of them so that people get a flavor for the kind of work that you do.
Yeah, just really briefly, a couple that have received the most positive feedback is one I did really recently, for example, called The Lost Cosmonauts, which is it's based...
Oh, that was disturbing. That upset me.
Yeah, a lot of people found it kind of scary and creepy, but it's also something that most people hadn't heard about. It's these two brothers who, in about 1960 in Italy, they made a bunch of recordings, kind of pirate hacker recordings of space broadcasts during the space race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and they got a lot of several recordings that they interpreted as cosmonauts dying in space that there's no historical record of. And these recordings of people's last breaths and their frightened cries for help can be pretty creepy, and it's a really interesting subject.
Yeah, I was actually afraid to listen to that. If I really thought I was listening to someone dying, I wouldn't want to listen.
Yeah.
But we want people to listen to your podcast, but do you think they were, in the end, did you say that they were dying?
Well, here's the problem with it. It doesn't match up, the timing doesn't work. At the time that these recordings were made, the Soviets were still launching mannequins and dogs. And it wasn't until many months later, when they were still launching mannequins and dogs, that they finally sent a real cosmonaut into orbit. And so the timing of these people dying in space, it just doesn't quite fit with what we know of the way that the Soviets, how they worked during the space race. They never went backwards, and neither did the United States. We didn't go from launching people back to launching chimpanzees, for example.
Well, we didn't, but don't you think the Russians might have done something horrible, like just send some people up to see what happened when they weren't really ready to do it?
No, I don't, because the nature of the space race was a battle of propaganda, and they didn't take any risks, and neither did we. They took one step at a time. They progressed as they were successful at each stage. Then they would go to the next stage, and it just doesn't make any sense that they would have made this huge of a leap this early, in 1959, for example, when they didn't even have a booster capable of lifting something out of Earth's orbit. It just doesn't quite fit with what we know of the timeline.
Now, another one that you did that used recordings that I found actually scared me. You know, sometimes I listen to podcasts when I'm trying to fall asleep at night, and then I'll fall asleep, and then something might wake me up. And something that I fell asleep to and then woke me up and really actually scared me was those numbers channels on the radio.
Oh, yes,
channels
the numbers
where people are just saying numbers forever.
Yeah.
That upset me.
Yeah, that one's really kind of unique, because this is a question that people ask me all the time is, gee, have you ever researched one of these subjects and found out that it turns out to be real, that there is no misconception about it? And that's one where largely that's the case. These number stations are shortwave radio stations all around the world. There's a lot of them that are popular, that are regular. They broadcast the same time every day on a schedule, and it's just somebody saying numbers: 3, 2, 1, 4, and usually it's an automated voice, a computer voice, and it's been found out that these are, in fact, intelligence agencies, in some cases, broadcasting encrypted instructions to spies. There have been 2 cases where people have been arrested and convicted of treason for receiving these number stations broadcasts and decoding them with a laptop computer. So that's something it's got not only the creepiness factor, but it actually has a real sort of, Men in Black aspect to it that's quite fascinating.
You know, does it seem that there's actually an element to the human mind that tends to make conspiracy theories or to think in a sort of a paranoid style, and it actually has some functional use that you can see that we might have evolved to have, where you take signs and you put them together and you figure out what's really going on, but that it kind of interacts with our imagination and storytelling, and so we make up some wild stories too, like we imagine aliens or supernatural beings, but that it actually is part of the way the human mind has evolved or is designed to work. Yeah,
well, you see the footprints and you assume that it's a saber-toothed tiger, and that's an example of the mind evolving to be wary of.
We want an exciting story, so that if some weird, unexplainable thing happens, we'd like the idea to think that it's a miracle from God, or that maybe there are aliens, or then the sort of scary side of it, that there are dead people coming back, or that the government is has a secret agenda that is really evil, or something like that. I mean, we're kind of telling stories, aren't we?
Who doesn't love a good story? I mean, everyone loves to be the one telling a good story, to be the one breaking the fascinating news to their friends, and everyone loves to think that there's something fascinating and marvelous going on in the world. In addition, everyone would love to have superpowers, for example. So everyone likes to believe that things like, psychic powers are real, that you can read minds and things like that. So people are very much conditioned to believe in these kind of things.
Not everyone, though. I mean, some people are more disposed, as I would assume you are, to thinking there really is a scientific explanation for everything. If something happens and I can't explain it, it's just that I haven't explained it yet, or I just don't know enough about it yet, but if I could study it further or could get to perfect knowledge, there would be a scientific explanation for it. Whereas there are a lot of people who are just looking for stuff that can't be explained by science, and they jump to the conclusion that it must be a miracle or it must be alien.
Yeah, I would say that everyone is at least equally predisposed to believe in such things and to be enthusiastic about such things, where the real difference is that some people have been trained and have more experience in practical, applied critical thinking than others. Most people never get exposed to it. That's why people end up, sitting in front of Oprah all day. And it's not the same thing as being familiar with critical thinking and skeptical thinking and being able to apply what we've learned of science to these things that we observe in the world and that are too easily misinterpreted as something supernatural.
Do you blame early childhood education? I once got into a dispute online with some people where I had just suggested that it would be good to teach children reading using nonfiction books, books that explain scientific things and history and things about the real world rather than emphasizing fantasy stories and fiction. And I got just like slammed by people who worked with children who thought it was just terrible to deprive children of stories and thought that early childhood was all about fueling the imagination and having fun with stories. And I was saying, well, I'm not really saying stories are bad, but wouldn't it be good, since you're in school and you're learning to read, to have well-written, interesting texts that were about facts about, animals and plants and geology and history and so that they would be learning some things about the world too. And I got just slammed by teachers, and I was thinking that maybe there's a certain sort of person that goes into teaching or working with children that really doesn't have a lot of respect for rationality and the real world and nonfiction.
Yeah, I think that what's really lacking in education, particularly when you get to the high school and even the college level, is applied critical thinking. It's all well and good to study, the Socratic questions and Aristotle and all that stuff, but it's not really relevant to people's actual daily lives. If you could point to describe students a story like the Amityville Horror or the Philadelphia Experiment. These popular things that everyone sort of has a belief about, and then teach them how to apply critical thinking skills to these topics. That's where you're going to get. That's where you're going to get the big moment where someone actually learns, and it's going to have a real.
And I mean, your book really. You should go wide with the marketing of this book, because I think it would be a great book to have in schools, because it does begin with a story that does fuel the imagination and is very exciting. And is often actually somebody's work of fiction, like with the Amityville Horror. And then you demonstrate critical thinking, and it's all very sharply written. And I think,
Thank you.
I think it would be really would work well for students. How young do you think someone could read your book? Maybe like a middle school student?
Yeah, I'd say middle school, and actually I'm doing a revised edition of the first volume of Skeptoid, because I think I've been able to improve it quite a bit with the second edition to make it even better for general audiences. It's not dumbed down by any stretch, but it assumes that the reader is not an expert in whatever the particular scientific discipline is that we're talking about.
Yeah. I'm not suggesting that it's a children's book, but I think it's the kind of book that I think my sons would have been very interested in when they were young. They love to read books about amazing facts, not just because they wanted to read fictional stories, but because they wanted to be surprised and amazed and then see why it really made sense on a factual level. So I think there are a lot of eager minds for that sort of thing. Maybe you should do a children's version of it, so really young. I would like to see critical education taught to really young children.
If someone writes me a check, I'll be glad to make whatever versions of it anyone wants. I'm pretty much maxed out at this time.
I think, maybe they should give you a MacArthur Award or something like that, so you can do the early childhood version of this. Anyway, but I want to get back to the subject of what do you think are some of the other of your best stories, and I was going to say that they seem to fall into categories where some of them are just frauds that people wrote, or things that originated in fiction or some kind of a money-making scheme, like some of those ghost stories, and other things are really just mysterious things in nature. Then was there another? Then there are things that are just commercial frauds.
Yeah,
homeopathy.
Things like magic jewelry and some of these multi-level marketing products that have no, conceivable scientific value. The magic jewelry, sometimes it's called ionized jewelry, or sometimes it's said to be magnetic, and they make all these ridiculous claims that it can cure cancer or cure chronic fatigue or even just really medically meaningless but vague scientific sounding benefits, like it restores your balance or it boosts your immune system, things like this. And these are just straight up fraudulent products, and a lot of times the FDA does come down and finally nail these people. Unfortunately, the FDA is grossly underfunded and unable to attack any fraction of these people who are out there. But I do talk about a lot of those on the podcast and in the book. And I also talk about urban legends. We mentioned Amityville Horror, things like that. And
so Amityville Horror was just a complete fiction made up by people who were trying to make money, right?
Invented by authors, yeah. And the history of that is thoroughly documented. They went and saw The Exorcist, which was really popular at the time, was in theaters. They said, that's a good idea. They contacted a book publisher, presto. Everything that's in the book that was said to have happened that can be falsified, like the doors being torn off the hinges or footprints in the snow, are false. There was no snow. The door hinges were fine and original. The police were never called to the property, even though that's a large theme of the story. But doesn't matter. People buy it anyway. People believe it without investigating it critically. People don't tend to look at most things and say, well, wait a minute, before I just believe that, let me analyze it and see how realistic it is. People don't think that way. It's too easy to fool people.
Speaking of footprints in the snow, there was one old Skeptoid about a long train of footprints somewhere in England. What was that one?
The devil walked in Devon, yeah.
Tell that story.
I don't remember the year, but in Devon, a county in England, there was people woke up in the morning. I believe this was in the 1800s. And there was a 100-kilometer-long trail of footprints that were said to be left by the devil. They were cloven footprints. And there was all sorts of stories about the footprints would go through a pipe that was laying on the ground and come out the other side. They would go through a wall and all of these impossible things across a river. And what's known about the story is basically what was reported and recorded in the newspapers of the era. And that's pretty much the level of what people know about this who have heard of it. And they say, wow, that's pretty hard to explain. Well, in fact, the explanation is quite mundane. The footprints, if you look more closely at them, were tiny. They were small animal-sized footprints, the size of, a little hopping rat. One possible explanation is there was a man who lived there who owned a number of tiny little species of tiny Australian wallabies who all escaped that day. And also we have this claim that there was 100 kilometers long of footprints in this very light snowfall, when the technology did not exist to travel 100 kilometers in a day at that time in that area. So who measured that?
Who was observing
knows?
It? Yeah.
Yeah. And you've got millions of small little forest animals running around in this county. It's a rural area. It's all hills and forests and trees. And the claims about it going through walls and things like this, these are secondhand stories made to a reporter during a time of alarmism when everyone was saying the devil was here last night. So it's really not very reliable reporting.
Yeah. Speaking of snow, also, one of the ones I like the most is that Dyatlov Pass story. That was one where when you told the story in the beginning about these various campers discovered on a mountain in the snow, and I guess it's Russia, I felt like, what could possibly explain that? There were so many elements to it that were so weird.
Very creepy.
What was that one?
Very creepy. So this was a group of students, was this in the 1950s? In Russia, at a university out in the middle of nowhere, out in the middle of, Siberia. It wasn't Siberia, it was the Ural Mountains. And this group of, I think it was about 10 of these students went cross-country skiing on a multi-day-long trip, and their bodies were found months later in various states of decomposition, but they had all died in strange ways. Some of them had internal injuries but no external injuries. One was missing a tongue. Their skin was said to have been turned orange, and their hair was said to have been turned gray, and they were radioactive. There was all of these strange circumstances. Some of them were almost naked. Some of them were wearing each other's clothes. And again, this is another case where the reporting is kind of unreliable because this is coming from inside Russia during the Cold War. Russia has always been very big into paranormal and UFO explanations, and so the reporters tend to spring to ideas like, oh, UFOs must have caused this. And in fact, we don't know what happened, but there's plenty of perfectly reasonable explanations for what could have happened. Their tent had been burst out from the inside. They were camped in an avalanche area. It's perfectly reasonable that they could have heard an avalanche, burst out of their tent, run away in the snow in whatever clothes they happened to be wearing, probably not very much, and quickly frozen to death. Some of them probably were caught up in an avalanche because their bodies were discovered at the bottom of a ravine tangled up among debris, and those are the ones who had the internal injuries. There's really nothing strange about it. And after you've been cross-country skiing for several days and getting sunburned in these days before sunscreen, and then your body's laying dead out in the snow for several weeks, who knows what color your skin is going to look like. The people at the funeral home said, oh, their skin was orange. Well, this is, of course, after they'd had makeup applied to them for the open casket funeral, which seemed kind of bizarre. There's as far as the radioactivity goes, they were using a type of lantern that uses a mantle that contains radioactive thorium. And these lantern mantles were still being manufactured even as recently as a few years ago by Coleman in the United States. It's not uncommon. It's certainly not a dangerous level of radioactivity, but there's perfectly rational explanations for everything that was reported.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that story because when you first hear all the elements, you feel like when you hear one thing on top of each other, where everybody was, and then the radioactivity, you feel like, well, that one's got to be aliens, right?
Yeah, and they always threw in a report that some orange spheres were reported seen in the region that same night. So,
that's
UFOs
yeah. So
did it.
People saw, another one that you wrote about that I actually got caught up in back in the 1970s, and I remember the huge fad, subliminal seduction in advertising. This idea that advertisers are actually putting sexual images into, the ice cubes in the glass of scotch in a photographic ad, and that there was just sex interlaced in all kinds of images in magazine and television ads that were designed to just control our minds and make us drink scotch and the like.
Yeah, it's a really commonly believed book. This book, Subliminal Seduction, that was published by someone who has no experience in the advertising industry. And this guy was something of a conspiracy theorist. He just thought that advertising agencies airbrush naked women into the ice cubes and that everything is, sexual imagery. When in fact, if you talk to anyone in the advertising business, they'll tell you that's absolute poppycock, that nobody has ever done that. If anyone did that, their clients would fire them immediately. It's the laughing stock of the advertising industry. And yet a lot of classes still use subliminal seduction to teach the students about advertising. And they come out of there going, wow, that's a terrible, shocking thing.
I bought that book, I read that book, and I took it seriously, and I just remember one thing about it was that he would say, well, of course all the ads have a subtle grid of the word sex printed all over everything.
Yeah.
And then he'd go on to explain the other things, but he'd just go off, well, of course the sex is written all over this.
Yeah.
And I would look, and I could never see sex written on it, but it was sort of like, well, that's like the primary level of understanding this, that you would see the word sex written on everything. And that was just so patently crazy that I don't know how he ever got that. Did anyone else see sex written all over all the ice cubes and all the liquor ads and everything?
He also believes that the letters SEX are printed on every Ritz cracker. I challenge anyone to find that. His book wasn't the first to deal with this subject, and it was based entirely upon the original seminal research in this study. Was conducted. I'd give his name if I had it on the top of my head, but I don't. But he went to a movie theater.
I know, Vance Packard.
Yes, there you go.
What's the name of that book? Hidden Persuaders. Vance Packard, Hidden Persuaders, was a book maybe published around 1960 that talked about how ads manipulated us.
Yeah. So he went to a movie theater and set up a projector to flash the words. I forget what it was, but it was, "Are you hungry? Get some popcorn."
Oh, that's something else, yeah.
Or buy some
I'm talking
Coca-Cola.
about a book that was about advertising, and you're talking about the famous subliminal advertisement. Was that ever actually done, or is that just a folk tale that it was done?
It was not a folk tale. I mean, this guy actually claimed these results from this test, that people did buy more popcorn and Pepsi when this was tried in the movie theater. And then later it was revealed that he falsified his test results. And then later he admitted that he never did it at all. And so it was a straight up lie. That never happened. James Vickery was his name, who did this research. And it's drink Coca-Cola and hungry, eat popcorn were the words that he flashed on the screen, allegedly. Turns out he never did.
Wasn't there a test done in Israel or something like that, where they actually tried using subliminal?
I don't know about that one.
Do you know about the person that claims to talk backwards while he's interviewing people and is able to manipulate them into doing things?
Oh, he's saying what he actually means when speaking in reverse?
That he's talking to people and convincing them to do things, and if you play it backwards, that he's actually saying some suggestive things backwards, and then that is tricking them.
You're talking about David John Oates, the Australian guy?
I don't know. What's that? Is that when you've done a...
I'm searching through my notes here as you're talking, trying to find... Well, David...
I think there's a YouTube video about that, but obviously they could put anything on it.
I'm not sure if it's the same thing you're talking about, but this guy is a proponent of reverse speech, he calls it, when you... if you were to take something that somebody says, for example, a politician, and if you play it backwards, you'll hear them say what they actually mean. He believes that brains work in such a way that it forces us to choose words to say what we actually mean, even though we might be lying when we actually say what we're saying. It's kind of silly, but that was another really popular episode because I included a lot of audio clips of these things. You play it backwards and you can hear what people say, and that's a really fascinating psychological phenomenon, too.
Now, that reminds me a little of this computer program that you see used on the web where they make a word cloud. They'll take a political speech and then they'll present it graphically, showing the most common words with the words in different sizes, depending on how often they were used. And then we're sort of invited to look at that picture, that graphic depiction of the words they used a lot, and then we can see what that person is really about. So that if they're saying money a lot, then that means they might not have, in the actual individual sentences, there are no statements about that, but you can see what they really care about, or Iraq is bigger than Afghanistan, or whatever. I noticed that after the big debate last night, the Barack Obama ad that went up online was about how McCain never said middle class. And it's sort of like, he said all of these things. He may think he may want you to care about the middle class, but actually he never said the word middle class, so that proves something. I don't know, but that's not as strongly connected as this point of the sort of word cloud graphic depictions of speeches. Have you seen those? Yeah,
well, that's more actually my professional background, which is in computer science. That's more my area. It's a simple type of artificial technology called collaborative filtering. That's the leading edge of what people are working on in that technology is just trying to make it more efficient and less server intensive to do more effective word comparisons. And it can come up with some pretty interesting results sometimes when I
think stuff like that is worth interpreting. I've come into some criticism for looking. Well, I mean, you could talk generally about do you think Freud is a fraud? I mean, Freud had all of this about the sexual symbols in the things people were saying or writing, and I've gotten attacked for, sometimes I do it slightly comically, so I'm not really completely on the hook that I really mean this, or it's sort of just for fun. But, for example, back a while ago when Hillary Clinton did this ad with that was sort of a spoof of the last scene on The Sopranos, where she was on The Sopranos, they ordered onion rings for the table, and then in the Hillary Clinton ad, instead of ordering onion rings for Bill, she orders carrots and says that she's looking out for him, and it's for his health, and we know he's had a heart attack. And I was sort of riffing on this kind of Freudian or pseudo-Freudian idea that, she was denying him the onion rings and forcing him to have the carrots, and it was sort of a sexual denial, and that the onion rings symbolized, the woman's sexual part.
Yeah.
Anyway, but so some of that is just comical riffing that I do. But do you think there's anything to this idea that, there are sexual images in things, and they're used or they are effective in manipulating us or massaging us in one way or another?
Obviously there are, but the question is whether they're subliminal or not. More likely they're overt, because that's what people want. I think Freud was just a good marketer. He said, gee, if I write about sex, I'm going to sell more books. And he's absolutely right. When you drape a bikini model across the hood of a Camaro for a TV commercial, that's not subliminal advertising. That's overt sexual imagery. There's no secrets about that. Yeah. That's what actually people want. That's probably what works.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what do you think of Freud generally? Have you ever thought of debunking, or I guess Freud has maybe been debunked by some of the Freud Wars stuff from back in the 80s, but have you ever thought of writing about any of that?
He is one of the people who is still on my to-do list. People send me ideas for the podcast far more often than I'll ever be able to catch up with. And he's someone that people have sent me that probably 2 or 3 times. And so it's definitely in my idea folder. It's on the future list.
Yeah, I mean, he was massively successful in promoting himself and his theory and making people for 100 years speak in his framework.
Sure, yeah.
That's powerful. Now, one thing that I'm particularly interested in is the way, the things that smart people really believe and continue to believe, especially the things that affect, that they spend a lot of money on, or that they actually sacrifice their health to, like homeopathy, which I actually think my mother sacrificed her life to. And vitamins, organic food, things like that people spend tons of money on for no real purpose. Could you talk about some of those? Yeah,
that's a common theme that I talk about a lot, and it all boils down to the fact that people don't like to get unpleasant, complicated answers from their doctor. The human body is a very complex mechanism. It's not as simple as the linguistic dichotomy of antioxidants and oxidation, which people think, hey, take some antioxidants and you won't age. Well, it's not nearly as simple as that. And when it comes to things like homeopathy or this whole vaccine autism link, people want to hear a simple answer that tells them that you do have control over your body and you can cure your cancer or cure your arthritis or whatever that it is that you have with this simple tool that's all natural. And this is just a huge list of logical fallacies. And since these products that are sold as supplements are not regulated by the FDA, they're allowed to make virtually any claim they want that's vague enough to skirt the regulations. They can say, I mentioned earlier, they can say vague things like they restore your balance or they, energize your, centralize your energy fields or anything like that. That's absolute nonsense, but people don't know that that's nonsense. It sounds reasonable. If it's printed on a product package, it must be true.
People like the idea that there's a holistic explanation for things, that something might be wrong with one part of them, but that they could somehow address the entire body and their entire life, like their whole spiritual attitude, and that it would all be an integrated whole, and they want an Well, I mean, it's kind of, it's kind of touching, I think, or something about the human nature that we want a whole explanation, or we want something to involve our soul as well as our body, and not just something wrong with some little part of my body. We want it to be about, a whole transformation of the self.
Yeah, it's really emotionally satisfying to think that things are as beautiful and elegant and simple as that. And, the fact of the human body in medicine is that virtually nothing is that simple. Certainly, there's no cure-all product. There's no herb you can take that will cure everything. You mentioned the idea of reflexology, for example, or chiropractic are both very similar in that they assume that one particular part of your body, for example, this part of your hand affects your heart, and you can massage that and cure your heart disease. That's what reflexology is based on, with a foot massage, where every part on the bottom of your foot corresponds to some organ or some potential disease. Chiropractic has the same assumption based on your spine. No matter what's wrong anywhere in your body, somewhere on your spine you can touch something or manipulate something and it will heal whatever illness that you have.
Is chiropractic completely a fraud, though? I mean, I go to a chiropractor, and he seems to help me with a lot of things having to do with my actual back. Obviously your nerves do go in through your spine, and we do have a nervous system. Is it really absurd to think that it's all connected?
Well, there's different kinds of chiropractic. There's what I'm talking about is straight chiropractic. They're called straight chiropractors, which are the guys who adhere to the original, essentially magical-based beliefs that were developed, early when people there was very little knowledge of the human body then, and this was the best assumption someone could make at the time. And what you're talking about are called reform chiropractors, who essentially they compete with physical therapy, conventional physical therapy, for some types of lower back pain and lower back problems. A good reform chiropractor will not tell you that massaging your spine is going to cure your cancer or make one leg longer or something like that. Those are not evidenced by any responsible scientific research. So yes, many chiropractors do have, they will help certain types of lower back pain and back problems, but they're essentially doing the same thing that physical therapists do. My question for them is, why call it chiropractic? Why not just become a doctor of physical therapy and be licensed to do what you're doing instead of performing unlicensed physical therapy and calling it chiropractic? It doesn't make any sense.
So you're kind of putting that into an unfair trade practices framework where it seems like the people who are calling themselves chiropractors are taking a kind of a shortcut to therapy that would normally take more training.
Well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't take more training. It's not really a shortcut. I mean, it's. I talk to chiropractors about this all the time, so I'm not, just making this up. And a lot of chiropractors do agree with me. They say, yeah, you do have a point. I mean, chiropractic should change. Chiropractic should, formally abandon this whole magical thing. That they call it innate intelligence. Is what they call this alleged energy field that surrounds your body, and that, adjusting your spine, that's the mechanism by which it will heal anything wrong. A lot of chiropractors say we agree.
And they talk about subluxations. What is that?
Well,
is that anything real?
Okay. There's an orthopedic subluxation, which is a real medical phenomenon, and that's something that's observable with imaging, with an MRI or with an X-ray. Then there's a chiropractic subluxation, which has nothing to do with it, and it's defined extremely vaguely. It's this or this or this or this is the official chiropractic definition of a subluxation, and it is not detectable on an X-ray, and it's usually said to be something like a nerve impingement in the spine, as you mentioned earlier. Well, of course, if you actually had a nerve impingement in your spine, manipulation is not the way to proceed. That's how people become disabled and how you cause real injury. So the best chiropractors will not even use the word subluxation. And the good chiropractors who are doing conventional physical therapy will not use the word subluxation. And if they suspect that you have a nerve impingement, they will probably send you to a medical doctor to get that treated, because usually that can only be treated with surgery, not by manipulation.
That's disturbing. Now,
well, I mean, you need to talk to a bunch of chiropractors. You need to talk to some reform chiropractors, and you need to talk to some straight chiropractors, and you'll hear them echoing what I'm telling you. I'm not making this up. I'm not a chiropractor myself, so I can't tell you these things. I go by what they tell me in our conversations.
I think maybe one reason people like the alternative medicine is they sort of like the kind of sense of nurturing and care that they're getting, that they're not being treated to the kind of sterility of the medical profession. That something about science seems unwarm and not caring about their soul. And although I think some doctors are kind of trying to transform the way they treat patients so that it'll seem more like the way alternative medicine people talk to you, so that you won't abandon them for that. I mean, sometimes I go to the doctor and I feel like, don't you have other things to do? Why are you spending so much time talking to me? And I can tell they're just trying to seem, they're trying to model warmth or something so that I'll think well of what they're doing. But I don't really need that. But I think that maybe That's what a lot of people are looking for, that they're looking for something that's a little bit like religion, that they may not be particularly religious people, but they still have spiritual needs that they're trying to get from healthcare people, even if the health stuff is bogus. I mean, it's sort of like religion may not be so available to them, so they're doing something that's really a religion substitute.
Mm-hmm. You know, people like me who are critical of complementary and alternative medicine, non-evidence-based medicine, are frequently criticized with the charge that, oh, well, doctors they're all in conspiracy with the big pharmaceutical industries that pay them kickbacks, and doctors never have time to talk to you. They say, here's your prescription for a drug, go take it and get out of my office. Right. And that's just absurd. One of my common themes is that in every slice of humanity, in every profession, you've got all kinds of people. There are good doctors, and there are doctors who are probably just like I described. Equally, there are alternative practitioners who are just like that. And there are, you see, a lot of alternative practitioners, here's their benefit. They're not obligated to practice medicine. They're not required to tell you bad news or to tell you the truth. They can simply say, hey, herbs will cure your cancer. That's fine. They can tell you.
They're caring for your spirit.
They're not a doctor.
I mean, they're more like religious practitioners, aren't they? What surprises me is when intelligent, educated people embrace things that are not rational, that are falsifiable by science. And I just think that they're maybe going to the same place that people go to with religion, that there's some basic psychological need for that kind of attention, even though it's not scientific. Or, I mean, it may be scientific in some psychological way that people have that need.
It all comes back to people really want to believe that they can control their own body. It's so comforting to think that you and your body are one spiritual being, and you know whatever you say or want or believe will translate to your wellness. You know, there's some truth to that. It's great to be, you know, someone who thinks positively about yourself and to care about what you eat and to treat your body well. You know, but it's not like if I break my leg, I can think happy thoughts and it's going to mend itself. It doesn't work like that, and that's what the worst of the alternative practitioners sell to people. You know, one of the episodes I did, this is worth mentioning. One of the episodes I did that received a lot of really positive feedback was in response to a letter that I received from a listener whose best friend had just been diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and it was just a terrible tragedy for the family. The guy had small kids and everything, and he was trying to treat it with a Quack device called the wet cell battery, which was invented by Edgar Cayce, who was an early 20th century celebrity psychic, and he healed people allegedly by having dreams and then having his dreams transcribed by somebody. It was awfully strange, but he invented a whole range of these Quack devices that have no possible medical application. So this poor guy with ALS is now paying $200 a month for this wet cell battery, which they sold him, telling him that it would cure his ALS, which is just criminal on so many levels. And so I did a podcast about this, basically for this guy to help him talk to his friend and explain to his friend that you got to stop doing this. You're making a bad situation worse. Just because.
Do you know whether the man heard the podcast?
Yes, I do. I did hear back from the guy later, and the guy did get off the battery, so it was a success.
Oh, wow. You know what? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
You know, he was trying to treat this thing with this stupid wet cell battery, and when he found out that the whole family kind of had an intervention with him, and they said, "Look, you're making a bad situation worse, and just because you have ALS, that doesn't make you always right, and it doesn't mean that you can make things worse for your family like this. You need to stop. You need to stop doing this." They got him off of it. They said he was angry that he had been taken advantage of. And that's good. I think that's a positive first step.
One of the podcasts that you did that seemed to have to do with the most damage to real people in the world was the one about genetically modified food. I was very, could you talk a little about that one? I mean, people are afraid of genetically modified food and are willing to go to extremes to ban it. But you made some extremely good points about, the billions of people that have been saved by genetically modified.
It's billions with a B. It's not millions. Most of the world lives on rice that has been created by genetically modifying rice strains to increase its output by as much as a factor of 10. It's virtually every food in the supermarket has some genetically modified component to it. When you modify crops to make them more resistant to disease, you reduce the need for fertilizers, for pesticides, for herbicides. It's good in every way. However, part of the problem is that these products are patented by companies like Monsanto, and they make money selling it. And so automatically, a lot of people who have sort of anti-corporate tendencies see that as a bad thing, and they assign all of these other made-up dangers to it, like it's going to contaminate the other crops and it's going to poison us, and they say things as silly as you're going to grow a third eye or something if you eat genetically modified food. What is it, radioactive? Of course not. The number of people who've been saved by genetically modified food and the amount of acreage that we're able to reduce. We have to chop down less rainforests to make, we don't need as much acreage to plant crops anymore. It's such a wonderful advance, a scientific advance in every way. It's better for people, it's better for the environment, much better for the environment. And for some reason, people just attack it with all sorts of xenophobic fears that are absolutely ungrounded.
Well, people who have the kind of politics that suggest that they really care about poor people and the less well-off often have environmental beliefs that are exaggerated, and they're really willing to do extreme things in the name of environmentalism, even though it would be extremely damaging to vast numbers of poor people. So there's a kind of a hierarchy of the things you're willing to put your scientific attention into. So there are people who are very strong about, toxic things in the atmosphere and so forth, or dangers to evolution with the biotechnology. But meanwhile, there are many. I don't know. You have something to say about the sort of political hierarchy that people who purport to have strong beliefs in that area are taking.
You make a great point. Is the very people who are most critical of genetically modified crops are the very people who, for their stated beliefs, they should be its biggest supporters. It's you take this event that happened in Africa in the 1990s, where Greenpeace successfully lobbied the governments of several African nations to reject thousands of tons of genetically modified crops that would have fed millions of people in those countries. And as a result of that, starvation and death continues because these countries have been convinced that these crops are somehow poisoned. Greenpeace has even told them that these crops are designed by the U.S. government to cause AIDS in Africans. It's awful, horrible things that the worst of these extremists are doing. Now, obviously, I'm not making a generalization about your average Greenpeace member or the Sierra Club or anything like this. Most of those people who are in those organizations are genuine environmentalists who are concerned about the world. But some of their most vocal extremists, unfortunately, they do not think very critically about the philosophies they say that they espouse. And as a result, we see all kinds of problems happening in the world. We see more starvation. We see more acreage being cut down because they say we have to grow crops organically instead of with modern efficient techniques.
People seem to selectively appeal to science. So there's a kind of a political pattern or a psychological pattern to when you go to science and when you opt out. So it seems to me one thing about critical thinking is that you should adopt it neutrally across all subjects, but people don't want to do that. They want to get scientifically critical about their preferred subjects, but they're picking and choosing for irrational reasons.
You're hitting the nail on the head.
They appeal to science when they're in the mood to do it.
You're hitting the nail on the head. Too many people let their politics determine their science. And I say the two issues have nothing to do with each other, and you should not let your politics determine your science, any more than you should let your science determine your politics. You can have whatever political values appeal to you, and you should also think critically and scientifically about everything, regardless of your politics.
Now, no one's really in a position to understand everything scientifically, just as no one can know all of the political details when they decide which policy to adopt. So people kind of have to have shortcuts. They have to have, maybe an ideology to decide what they want to think, because they really can't study everything unless they're going to just start relying on experts. But it's not science to rely on experts. The experts could be wrong. I mean, a lot just depends on whether we can trust scientific experts to really be telling us the truth. But, then one's political ideology influences when you're willing to believe the scientists. Like, for example, with respect to global warming, there's a big divide between, I think, basically lefties and righties about whether they think that global warming is a real phenomenon and whether it's caused by human beings. And it seems to me that people are deciding which side they want to believe and then deciding which scientists to trust as being reliable. But I just don't know how much science there is in any of that for the average person, because they have to rely on scientific experts, but they have to decide who they want to trust, and they seem to have to rely on the shortcut of their political ideology to decide who's trustworthy.
Yeah, that's a very real problem. Many people will pick up some cause and they'll run with it without researching it thoroughly. For the average lay person on the street, I mean, we mentioned vaccine and autism a few minutes ago, and just to use that as an example, what most people know about that is what the celebrities are saying. There's a handful of celebrity activists out there promoting this vaccine autism link. And, well, okay, for Joe Blow, how do you determine whether there's any validity to that or not? You go on the internet and do a search for it, and you're just going to find a lot more of those celebrity claims and everything. So how do you find out what scientists you should listen to? How do you know what's actually the scientific consensus? What is actually the best state of our knowledge? The scientific consensus is not always right, but it's usually right, and it is the best information that we have. And it does evolve over time in many cases. But it's always going to be more reliable than going to a celebrity and asking them what they think. So,
yeah. But even with respect to scientists, I mean, I often suspect, and maybe this is the sort of paranoid thinking style, but I often suspect that the scientists are colluding to present a kind of phony united front because they have a policy preference, and if they all say this is what the science says, then we'll be silenced because what do we know? We don't know what the science is. We have to trust them, and so then they are really trying to push us into a policy position that we wouldn't adopt in terms of pure policy, but they're using their expertise to bamboozle us.
There's no doubt that happens, but there's a way to protect yourself against that too. I mean, you can you can identify that, and you can get around that and find out what the real science is, just by doing a little bit of of legwork and doing the research yourself. You've got to get away from the mass media first of all, because whatever is reported through the mass media is not necessarily what's reported in the best scientific journals. Any scientists who go to the media to report their results rather than to a scientific journal, that's a huge red flag right there. And what I would advise people is you've got to figure out, first of all, what are the best scientific journals, because every rag that anyone publishes claims to be a peer-reviewed scientific journal. You can't simply go on that claim. And for the person on the street, this is not a perfect solution by any stretch of the imagination, but I argue that it's the best one for the person on the street who is just a layman and who is not a scientific expert, is go to Wikipedia and look up their article on lists of peer-reviewed scientific journals. The first page of that list is a pretty darn good list because it is reviewed quite frequently and edited and updated and kept clean by scientists in those fields. And again, that's not perfect, but it's the best available to the layperson. Stick with the journals that are on that first page, or if you have to drill down a level or two, don't go very far, because the farther you drill down into that list, the less reliable the list becomes. But that's a good way to find out what's real good information. And then go to that journal's website and look up what you want to look up. 9 times out of 10, that's going to give you better information than what's available through any news source.
Speaking of celebrities, it makes me think of one of my favorite podcasts of yours, which is Anomalous in the group, which is the one about Tibet. A lot of celebrities are into this free Tibet thing, and they have been blessed as or recognized as holy by the Dalai Lama and so forth.
Yeah.
But you decided to deviate from the science area and actually do one that's political.
Yeah.
So tell us a little about why you decided to take on a political topic, and if you would do that again, and also what's so wrong about the Free Tibet folks?
Okay, well, the intention was not to deviate from science and stray into politics. How successful I was at that is a matter of debate. What my intent was to point out that most people's understanding of the Free Tibet issues is you have pictures of the evil Chinese communists in 1957 on one hand, destroying the monasteries with their howitzers. And then on the other hand, you've got the wonderful, peaceful, loving Dalai Lama who writes books on metaphysics and goes around the world blessing people. The good man and the evil Chinese. And that's the depth of most people's understanding of the Tibet situation. And so my intent was to just simply provide more of the historical foundation, how Tibet was before the 1957 revolution, and a little bit of the ancient history going back thousands of years. Anyone who says that this is a simple issue is being very disingenuous. It's not a simple issue at all. And also, not even the Dalai Lama is arguing to free Tibet. He's arguing to change Tibet from an autonomous region to a special administrative region. How does that fit on a sign? If you're a Hollywood activist, how do you go change Tibet to a special administrative region? It just doesn't work as a soundbite at all. Saying free Tibet sounds beautiful and wonderful, but
and also they've excluded this whole issue of slavery. The idea that the free Tibet people are connected to a horrible history of slavery.
Yeah. Living in Tibet
is embarrassing.
Living in Tibet prior to 1957 was very similar to living in a country under Islamic Sharia law. The tortures and executions were just horrific. But again, I'm not trying to take one side or the other, because certainly the Chinese don't have a great human rights record either. Shortly after the revolution, we entered into these big Chinese, revolutions where millions of people died, including plenty of Tibetans. There's an argument, though. Was that period worse for Tibetans than the existing Tibetan system had always been? And that's not a simple answer either. Essentially, what the changes that the monk class, the Dalai Lama's class is asking for now, puts them back into their palaces, but continues the economic aid flowing from China. Tibet could not survive at all without the economic aid that China does and has always provided to them. Simply freeing Tibet, cutting it off completely from China, would be disastrous for everyone involved. I mean, you'd have just widespread poverty and death immediately in Tibet. The country has virtually no industry or output. I'm just trying to point out that it's a much more complicated issue than simply free Tibet.
Yeah, I mean, people go to these simple patterns that I think are connected to a lot of irrational things that they believe, like the romanticization of the third world, or of religions that are not the ones we're dealing with immediately in our environment. It's this religion over there that seems very charming, and we like the art, we like the clothing, we like the architecture. It seems very sweet and lovely in just a kind of nostalgia for something we never knew sort of a way.
Yeah.
And it's completely irrational, really, to think like that. It's sort of a kind of artistic thinking that I don't know, maybe movie stars are particularly given to. And then it seems beautiful to us because the beautiful people love the beautiful things. We should be on that side, too.
It's always good PR to be on the side of the good, beautiful things.
Yeah.
I mean, if I were a Hollywood celebrity and trying to promote my image, I would probably do the same thing too. I mean, I understand where they're coming from. They're certainly not coming from the perspective of doing responsible historical research, though.
We're getting close to the hour, but I was just going to raise one more thing. In preparation for this dialogue, I sent an email around to my colleagues at the law school trying to get them to fess up to the irrational things that they believed in, because I, in fact, have had the personal experience of law professors at my law school telling me that they believed in astrology. I had once rejected going out with some guy when he revealed that he believed in astrology, and I had to tell him I didn't respect him because of that. And the first two people I told separately that I had done that immediately volunteered that they believed in astrology. And I guess I should remind people of the old podcast that you did on the subject of how to be a skeptic and not lose all your friends or something like that, because apparently just telling people you think they're stupid is not really that effective. But I sent out this email to try to get people to volunteer some things that they believed in, like astrology. But I couldn't get them to admit that they believed in homeopathy or organic foods or whatever. They all went completely kind of political on me, and the kinds of answers that they were giving was what was it? They were saying things like progress, deliberative democracy, the rule of law. Yeah, and one guy said grammar, which I actually thought was a really interesting answer. But everybody skews political, and I put up a post on my blog today too to try to get some more. And now it's got a whole lot of comments on it, and I can't go back and read them. But everybody jumped in at the very beginning with answers about politics or religion. Yeah. So somebody said transubstantiation, and somebody said socialism, somebody said subprime mortgages, so people immediately, these sort of smart, educated people immediately said the irrational things that smart, intelligent people, of course not me, those other people, believe. They were all in the religious and political area. Uh-huh. And no one would fess up to the just blatant pseudoscience and fakery such as astrology.
Well, but you know what? That's the great first step. When you're talking to someone and you're trying to help them, someone who believes in something that's strange and weird and has no scientific foundation, when you're talking to them about that and trying to help them to take a step further than that, the step you've demonstrated, which is to help them point out what they don't believe in. You pick something totally strange, ask them what they don't believe in, they'll say something like, Bigfoot or aliens or something that's really obvious like that. Yeah. And then help them to understand exactly why they don't believe in that. Go through some of the logical fallacies that support those things. And then apply those to the subject that you're talking about. And that's when you're doing it in a non-confrontational way. You'll help them to understand, gee, you're right, I just wasn't thinking very, very critically about this.
Yeah. Well, so you're being the sort of friendly, kindly teacher, but don't you think there's something to the smack in the face, such as, Christopher Hitchens' book, Against Religion, or that Penn and Teller show on Showtime, Bullshit, where basically they just laugh in your face and tell you you're an idiot? Isn't there something to, we don't all have to be nice, do we?
There's something to that, and it's called good entertainment. It's not going to change any minds, though. No, I don't think the smack-in-the-face technique is ever productive if you're actually trying to educate people or change their minds. I think it makes great entertainment, though, and I love it. I love watching Penn and Teller's show, and I love listening to Christopher Hitchens speak. But I also don't pretend that they're going to change the minds of anyone that they're talking to. Yeah. You can do that. It
reminds me of the political debate on the Internet is often about calling people names and saying that the other people are idiots, and it's hard to get the kind of attention to a discussion that's actually about rationally discussing things.
Yeah. Well, this is why Christopher Hitchens is always going to sell more books than me. he might argue that there are other reasons too. But anyway.
But actually, the Blogging Heads project is a lot about getting people who are on opposing sides to talk to each other in a rational way. And I don't know what the actual traffic numbers are over here, but probably not the. Probably I bet the most popular episodes are the ones when somebody, occasionally me, actually gets really mad at the other person and lets loose.
Well, let me ask you.
It's just more popular.
What are the opposing sides that they matched us up for?
Wait, say that again?
What are the opposing sides that they matched you and I up for?
Oh, I just, they're not all in opposing sides. They actually asked me who I would like to talk to, and I said you, because I loved your podcast.
Thank you very much.
Sometimes people interview people that they're interested in talking to, and I suggested your name because I really just love your podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'm actually very honored that you do. I appreciate that.
And I enjoy your I think you have a very sweet, friendly voice. I like the way you're very sensible, and crisp and smart, and you sound like a very nice person, but you're conveying a lot of interesting information at the same time. So
you're embarrassing me.
I think it's a very nice model of a podcast that everyone should listen to and buy the book.
Thank you.
So on that happy note, and we've gone over an hour, I think we should end the dialogue so people can go on to eat their vitamins and look into their crystal balls
and drink their wheatgrass juice. Well,
get their subluxations snapped out of. And okay?
Well, thank you very much. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks for being on.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.